Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dhar.
Is addiction a tendency that afflicts just some of us who are wired in a certain way? Or is it a function of our environment? While it's true that some of us might have more addictive tendencies, be careful. Your addiction might just be around the corner, awaiting you in the form of a game or something designed to suck you in and cause some sort of serious long-term harm. It's good to be mindful about what you're up against. Joining me today is Adam Alter, who has studied addiction and written about it in his best-selling book called Irresistible. He describes the ingredients of various kinds of behavioral addiction and what we should be mindful about so we don't fall prey to it. And even more importantly, what do we need to do to preempt our kids becoming victims of the increasingly addictive products that are coming down the pike? Adam is a professor of marketing at the Stern School of Business at NYU. I've been a big fan of his ever since I read his book called Drunk Tank Pink many years ago. Apparently, there's a pink bubblegum color that's been observed to calm aggressive prisoners, and football coaches have evidently picked up on this and started painting visitors' locker rooms pink, hoping to pacify their opponents. The takeaway is that if you want to calm people down, make them see pink, not red. Adam, you certainly pick fascinating book titles, and I found your book quite irresistible. Couldn't put it down once I started reading it. Welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks, Vasant. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
How's this COVID, I was going to say post-COVID era, but looks like it's just going on, isn't it? But how's this been for you last couple of years?
Yeah, it's been a strange time. Obviously, I haven't done much traveling, and I've started teaching again in person in the summer, actually, last summer. But for about a year and a half, I really didn't leave Connecticut where I live. I didn't leave the tiny little bubble around where I live. So it was a little bit strange. I'm sure that was true for you as well. But one of the things I was very interested in was how we were all forced onto screens. And I was very curious about whether that might change how we interacted with each other and obviously how we felt about screens in general.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, the post-COVID era where we went scurrying online, and I was maybe even the first to go online in Feb of 2020, is what motivated this podcast. So this is actually very relevant. I hadn't anticipated that this would go on this long, but it just seems to be going on forever and ever. How's your health been during this time?
It was good until about a week ago, but I have a cold, but nothing beyond that. But other than that, thankfully, we've all been well. We've been very, very careful and so far so good. Yeah,
that seems to be the case with most people I talk to is, people haven't had a cold in a couple of years. That's a good thing.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
So, Adam, let's get started with, I was intrigued when I read your book, and you start with this, in the prologue, with this cardinal rule of drug dealers, which is never get high on your own supply. And you ask the question, which is, why are the world's greatest public technocrats also its greatest private technophobes? So let's start with this cardinal rule of drug dealers that tech people seem to apply to themselves.
Yeah, I think a lot of us now are concerned about screens, and we're concerned about what they're doing to us and to our children. But that wasn't true a decade ago. I think that's a relatively new concern. But the first people to become concerned about screens, I think, were the people who are savviest about technology. I obviously call them technocrats in the book, but it's really just anyone who knows a lot about technology. And the example I gave in the book is Steve Jobs, who was really, really careful about bringing even Apple products into his home. Obviously publicly, he'd get up on stage and say, you need one of these, your kids need one of these, you need 2 of them, you buy 5 of them, buy as many as you like, keep using the products. And then there was this really fascinating interview with a New York Times journalist who would routinely ask Jobs questions about the products Apple had released. And he asked Jobs, tell us about how you use the product at home when the iPad was released. And Jobs said, we just haven't allowed our kids to use it at all, which I found pretty fascinating. And he wasn't the only one in that position. And the most striking example I came across was a school in the Bay Area that was about 75% of the kids had parents in the tech industry. And the school specifically kept kids away from technology until they were 14 or 15 years old. So everything was paper and pencil, a lot of outdoor learning, a lot of hands-on learning, but no screens. And that's very different from how most schools operate today. And I found that fascinating, that these tech giants, people who are really familiar with tech and what tech does, all the benefits of tech, were also very concerned about its potential harms.
I had a guest a couple of weeks ago, Anna Lembke, who's author of this book called Dopamine Nation. One of the questions that we explored, and I asked her, was whether we are all inherently addicts, whether we have it in us or whether this is something that's peculiar to some set of people. What are your thoughts about this?
I think it's a matter largely of environment. So certainly there's some small amount of variance. I think there are, this idea of the addictive personality is blown all out of proportion. I don't think that's quite true. But certainly there are people who are more prone to forming attachments to certain experiences or substances more than others. Putting that aside, though, if you create the perfect experience or the perfect substance and you put people in exactly the wrong situation, they will develop what amounts to an addiction. That's how I feel. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that. And the fact that so many of us spend 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day, despite recognizing all the problems with screens, we spend all that time glued to our screens, discretionary time beyond needing to be glued to screens for work, suggests to me that this is a problem with being human. It's part of the human condition that we do tend to have this propensity to develop these attachments to experiences and substances. So, I don't think this is just an issue that's reserved for a tiny minority, which is the way we used to think about addiction. I think it's something it's just part of what it is to be a human being.
Do you find that you're addicted to screens as well?
Yeah, I certainly am. I fight against it, but I'll pull back just for a second and say, when I wrote the book, I decided to use the term addiction because I think it's the right term. I think it describes the way we interact with our devices. And I can go through the definitions at some point if you're interested in why I think it's true.
Yes. Indeed, yeah. I am. In fact, I sort of jumped the gun a little bit because I think what we should do is just define what you mean by behavioral addiction. So let's just start there. Yeah,
it's a very controversial idea. So addiction is a loaded term, obviously, and a lot of people use it to describe a very small set of very circumscribed behaviors that involve substances. So a lot of people believe you can't be addicted without the presence of a substance that's acting directly on your body, on your physiology in the moment. I don't think that's true. And the definition of behavioral addiction I use is any experience that you want to engage in over and over again in the short term, despite recognizing that in the long run it's harming you in one way or another. And there are at least 4 different categories of harm that I've identified and that other people have identified. Social harms, ruining your relationships, degrading the connections you form with other people because the screen comes between you and those people. So that's the social harms. Psychological harms like loneliness, depression, anxiety, exposure to bullying, a lowering of your boredom threshold, so you're incapable of dealing with even a couple of minutes of idle time. Physiological harms, so becoming sedentary, where you sit in front of a screen for hours and hours at a time, which is obviously problematic. Perhaps driving more dangerously because we can't stop looking at screens. And then financial harms, so spending way more money on screens than we would like. And I think it's so much easier to spend money on a screen than it is to spend money in person that a lot of us end up frittering away just a huge amount of our disposable incomes on screen experiences. And so those are the 4 harms. But the basic idea is there's this difference between what we want to be doing in the short term and what we know is good for us in the long term. And that for me is the behavioral addiction. And importantly, it does not involve a substance. It's all just driven by very compelling, well-designed experiences. So are we conscious of the fact that this is causing long-term harm, or do we just sort of put that aside and say this is too good to ignore for now? It's funny, when I first started talking about this topic, which was about 8 years ago, I had to spend, if I gave an hour-long talk on this subject, I'd have to spend about half an hour educating the audience on the basics. Now, if I spend 5 minutes on that, it's boring the audience because I think a lot of people recognize these harms or at least have a sense of the harms. They're more introspective about them. They're more conscious of the possibility that being on a screen is harmful. So I think there's been a rise in education, which has been, I think, useful, and it's caused people to reflect more than they were doing before. And so there's value in that. I think a lot of those harms, though, are pretty transparent. When I talk to people and say, how do you feel about your relationship with screens? I think most people have an antagonistic relationship with screens and they recognize it, or at least ambivalent. So they'll say, I get a lot of benefit from my screen. Google Maps is the greatest thing on earth. I can't believe that I got by in the world without it before when I traveled and so on. On the other hand, I'm losing what amounts to 15 or 20 years of my life to these devices, which is obviously problematic.
Your reference to Google Maps made me, and I'm sort of jumping ahead here, reminded me of London cab drivers, who used to know the city, like the back of their hands. And, the last few times I've taken a cab in London, and this is true in New York as well, right? They just have no idea what the layout of the city looks like.
Yeah, the knowledge test they have to take in London, the cabbies, they studied up for years to do that. And it's obviously not even a part of the job description anymore, because we've outsourced so much of what our brains used to be able to do to devices.
Yep, indeed. And we'll come back to this in another context of, just the benefits of going through these exercises that seem difficult, like memorizing a map or memorizing other kinds of things, and the benefits we get from that. So let's get into the components or the ingredients of addiction and, what we're up against really, as individuals, given what's coming, what we've already had are amazing products, right? Amazing toys. But when I think of coming, the metaverse and virtual realities, and it just boggles my mind that we're going to be really tested, aren't we?
I think we are. I think there's this sense we have with any technology that we've reached a destination of sorts, that wherever we are at any moment in time is a sort of endpoint. And that's obviously not true in this sphere. So these technologies, these screen technologies, are fairly young. Social media is less than 20 years old. And I agree with you. I think we're going to a place where what's compelling now will seem like a joke when we look back in 10 or 20 years. It'll look like it was almost, Facebook will seem quaint to us, this current version of Facebook. And I think that'll be true about Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter as well, because there will be so many new products in the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years that these will all be part of the first basic generation of these products. And I think you're right. Between the metaverse and augmented and virtual reality technologies, if we can't stay away from a rectangular device today, when we have headsets on that literally separate us from other people, it's hard to imagine how we're going to operate as a social species. I think it's hugely concerning.
So what are the ingredients? I'm guessing that these ingredients will make their way into the next generation of devices as well, right? They just seem to be generic. So let's walk through them. What makes these devices so addictive?
Yeah, I think the ingredients will be amplified. So let's start with the first one. The one that I think is the most important is the eradication of what I call stopping cues. A stopping cue is a natural cue that exists in the world that gently tells you that it's time to move on to the next thing. And if you think about media in the 20th century and even the early 21st, stopping cues were everywhere. If you read a newspaper, you get to the end of the newspaper, or you get to the end of an article. If you read a book, you get to the end of chapters. If you watch a TV show, the TV show ends, the credits roll. That's a stopping cue. It tells you that you can either sit here on the seat for the next 26 hours, 6 days and 23 hours, or you can go and do the next thing that you want to do with your day. And tech companies, because of the way you can deliver information on screens, have managed to eradicate those stopping cues. And they've been doing that in a very concerted way for, I'd say, the last 10 to 15 years. I think the best, most striking example was the decision by Netflix to remove the default requiring that you push a button to play the next episode in a TV season. So what happens now, obviously, with post-play, this feature that was introduced in 2012, is that the end of an episode automatically loads the next episode. So 10 seconds after one episode, the next one begins playing. That seems trivial. I don't think anyone thought that was a profound change to the way we lived our lives. But what that does is it short circuits our ability to say, all right, I've got to stop here and move on. And so the next year, dictionaries all around the world had this term binge viewing as the term of the year, because it was this new thing that we were encountering. Then YouTube used the same autoplay feature. Then you started to see it on Facebook and on other platforms. That's just one example. But the bottomlessness of feeds on social media is another example. A lot of video games now automatically end and then start playing the next round. Or if your character loses a life, you automatically start playing. And all of this is an attempt to keep you doing what you're doing once you begin, so you aren't gently nudged onto the next thing. And that's the first ingredient, the eradication of stopping cues.
So casinos used to use this too, right?
That was the first successful example of stopping cue eradication. So casinos removing the ability to tell what time of day it was, taking all the clocks out of the casino. There are some really devilish examples in casinos as well. There are these loyalty rewards, is what they were called euphemistically, where, especially on the newer slot machines, where you can tell how long it's taking people to push the buttons between plays. If someone's sitting at a slot machine for, say, 3 hours, that's a huge source of value to the casino. And you can start to see that that person is likely to leave the machine because they just by a couple of milliseconds, they'll start to slow down between pushes of the button. And so you can see they're kind of emerging from this trance-like state. And that information will be routed through to a central office where there will be someone known as a loyalty consultant. That person will then go walk over to this person who's about to leave the slot machine and short-circuit the process by saying, we see that you've been on this machine for a few hours. Would you like a free drink? The person says, yes, thank you. So they get a free drink, and then they sit and they keep playing for another 2 or 3 hours. So casinos have been doing this for a very long time, and screens, the people who are designing products for screens and games have learned from that, and I think they've now applied that to a lot of the screen behaviors and the screen platforms we use.
You know, I used to use Harrah's as a case study many years ago, 15-ish years ago, when I used to teach digital strategy. But I had no idea that they had taken the technology to the level where it costs something to send a waitress over, with a drink. And why don't we just let the computer take that role over? That just boggled my mind. I had no idea that they had actually moved on to that next level where the computer now knows that you're slowing down and you might leave and offers you a reward or changes the odds slightly in your favor. That's just sinister, isn't it?
It's really sinister. There's a professor at NYU actually named Natasha Dow Schüll who spent 13 years researching casinos. She went to Las Vegas over and over again and spent a lot of time in casinos and with gamblers. And she documented a lot of these behaviors in a book called Addiction by Design. And it's absolutely fascinating and sinister and devilish. But I think a lot of technologists learned from what she found and what these companies were doing.
Yeah, indeed. Removal of stopping cues. What else are tech people doing to make their products more addictive?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think more borrowing from the casino, one of the most basic drivers of human behavior is unpredictable rewards. So there are very basically speaking, there are two ways to deliver rewards to a human being or to any animal. You can give it in a predictable way where you get the same amount of reward at the same predictable interval. So if you have a job where every 2 weeks you get a salary that doesn't change, you'll still go to that job. You'll probably, if you need the money, you'll keep working. But if you create a situation where people are getting rewards at unpredictable intervals, they have to keep doing a certain behavior, hoping they'll get the reward. And sometimes the reward is really large and sometimes it's much smaller, which is more like what happens when you play slot machines. That's way more compelling. That encourages much more behavior. And if you think about the kinds of experiences we have on screens, those variable rewards are absolutely everywhere. Email is basically one big variable reward. You never know what the next email is going to be. Is it going to be a good thing? Is it going to be someone asking you for a favor? Is it going to be someone giving you something? Is it going to be some good news? Is it going to be bad news? We never really know. Games, obviously, the games we play on our screens, there's a huge amount of variable rewards and unpredictability built into those games. Everything you do on social media platforms involves unpredictable rewards. Are you going to find a really interesting article? If you post something, will people respond to it or will they ignore you? So that uncertainty and then the kinds of rewards that come from positive feedback, whether people are engaging with you online or whether you get the email you're looking for or whatever the reward might be in the context of that particular product, it's much more compelling because it's unpredictable. That unpredictability is built into these products by design.
I hadn't actually appreciated the role of this uncertainty in drawing people in. There's something addictive about just the sort of uncertainty of behavior. And, it made me wonder whether human relationships are susceptible to the same phenomenon, right? You just become boring when you're predictable. Is the trick to a successful relationship to be just unpredictable? Obviously there's a right balance somewhere here, but it made me chuckle and think about whether that's true of human relationships in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's obviously a difference between a relationship where someone's compelling and a relationship that's healthy. So we know that the person who doesn't treat someone else particularly well can be very appealing. The kind of bad boy in the tropes of Hollywood is very appealing. And that's going to be true both ways, not just the bad boy. It's this kind of The unpredictability can be really compelling. It brings you in, it draws you in. It's terrible for your mental health. And that's where the addiction part comes in. You become addicted to this bad relationship. But absolutely, I mean, I think that makes the relationship very compelling. And so some people deploy this. It's a strategy that they use. Some people do it because that's just how they are. They don't mean to do it. But, for a healthy relationship, you want less unpredictability. But for a relationship that grabs people, that really compels them, especially early on, some unpredictability is very effective.
That's very interesting. So let's move on to the other sources of addiction you mentioned, like a craving to achieve certain types of goals that may or may not be achievable. By the way, I had no idea you were a marathon runner. I was fascinated by that chart I saw in your book about what the expected distribution of running times would be versus real distribution. So you talk about that, because I thought that's really fascinating, this sort of notion of, I think you refer to it as goals or something, but just walk us through it.
Yeah, so humans are completionists as a species, which basically means we don't like to leave a loop open if it's been opened for us. And goals are like that. If you embark on a goal, you want to complete the goal. And we get a form of reward. It gives us a sense of control over the environment. The world is inherently difficult to control, but when we master a goal, when we complete a goal, that gives us this burst of satisfaction that comes from having done something we set out to do. And goals are everywhere on platforms, but I think one of the most, profound examples of this, as you alluded to, is this example of marathon runners. So I've only run one marathon. I wouldn't say I'm a marathon runner, but I have run a marathon. It's a bit of a difference there. I ran a marathon about a decade ago in New York City, and based on my training, I figured out that I should run roughly a 3:30 marathon. That's what I was aiming for. I wanted to run a sub 3:30. And on the start line of the marathon, there were these people holding placards that had signs on them like 3:30, 3:15, 3:40, 3:45. So I walked up to the person with the 3:30 and I said, what happens if I run with you? And he said, I will run a 3:29. So if you stick with me, you'll run a sub 3:30. And I said, oh, that's incredible. How are you able to guarantee that? And he said, well, I can run a 2:16, so I should be fine running a 3:29. And, we ran, a group of us ran, there's a pretty big group of people who run the New York City Marathon who want to run a sub 3:30. And we ran with this guy for about 8 or 9 miles, about a third of the race. And it was pretty clear that we were running harder. Many of us were running harder than we wanted to. I was starting to struggle. And he actually turned to face us and started running backwards, coaxing us on, which turns out to be the most demotivating thing you can imagine. But I ran on. Eventually, he sort of receded into the distance because he was running much faster than I could run. And I realized I wasn't going to run a 3:30. It wasn't a good race for me at all. And then the 3:40 placard came by, then the 3:50 placard. And as we got about 5 kilometers from the end of the race, at like mile 23 or so, I started to think, well, I'm going to run over 4 hours. And that was pretty upsetting to me because it was a lot slower than I'd planned to run. And I said to myself, you know what? You got to dig deep. If you run over 4 hours, you have to do another marathon. And that was really deeply motivating to me. The idea that if I didn't run a sub 4, I'd have to do another marathon because I was in so much pain at that point. And I ended up pushing pretty hard. A friend of mine was on the course at that point, and he said to me, you're looking at running like a 4:01 or 4:02. And so I was pretty frustrated by that. I put on the afterburners, and I managed to just squeak in under the 4-hour mark. I ran like a 3:57. And on the finish line, I was sort of fascinated by that time, and I was like, very relieved. That's great that I ran under 4. And he said to me, this friend, after I found him at the end of the race, he said, I knew you were going to run a sub 4, but I was worried you'd slow down. So I told you you'd run a 4:01. I knew that would motivate you, which it did. And at the end of the race, I sort of wondered, how many people are running 3:57s, 3:58s, 3:59s? It seems like, I was deeply motivated. I wonder if other people were just as deeply motivated. And despite being completely depleted, I managed to run this sub 4, and I was sure other people did too. And what you see, and you alluded to this chart, this is from some research that some researchers, most of them at the University of Chicago, did, was they found that there's this great series of discontinuities at 2:59, 3:29, 3:59, 4:29, where those times just below the cutoffs, those half-hour cutoffs, are very, very common times to run. In fact, 3:57, which I ran, is the second most common time to run a marathon, in only second to 3:58. They're incredibly common times. And that's because the goal is so compelling, even as you're struggling, that people push on and push through. the 401, 402, in other words, missing the goal, is really uncommon. So most people squeak in under that mark. And it just illustrated for me, even in this pursuit where we are exhausted, you're at the end of your rope, you have nothing left, people still dig deep and still find a way to perform. And that's because the goal is really compelling. This round number goal is really compelling to us.
So how is this making its way into these digital products?
Well, humans are very sensitive to round numbers, as we saw from the marathon example, and round numbers are everywhere. So you've got certain numbers are prominent, like 0. Inbox 0 is a big one, trying to make sure that you read all your emails. That will keep you glued to the screen. If you use a social media platform and you post something, you'll have the same issue where you might want 10 likes, 100 likes, 1,000 likes, 1,000 followers, 10,000 followers, 5,000 followers. All these numbers, these round numbers really matter to us. And they matter to everyone because the way we count, the base 10 system means that those zeros at the end of a number mean something to us. And even the way the platforms present those numbers means something to us. On Twitter, you reach 10,000 and suddenly you graduate from having all the numbers in front of you to 10K and then 10.1K, 10.2K, because they're showing you that you reached a certain level. It's like a badge of honor. And I find that pretty compelling. It's hard to resist that. And as someone who, I don't use social media except for Twitter, but I'm very sensitive to those numbers, even knowing all of this. And so those goals are embedded in absolutely everything we do online.
Yeah, seems like we're wired around round numbers, aren't we? Which seems both motivational or addictive, depending on the context. You also talk about another kind of hook in the form of cliffhangers or open loops that are unresolved that get people hooked. I was really struck by the ending of Sopranos, which is one of my favorite shows, and you referred to that. It was the first time I'd seen a discussion because I thought the ending was like, what? After 6 seasons of just amazing content.
Yeah.
That was just like, wow, what a lame ending, and I had no idea that there was all of this discussion around this.
There is.
Until I read your book. So talk about that. What's the role of these cliffhangers in digital products?
Well, a cliffhanger is another example of this kind of open loop. One of them is goals that are unfinished, but another is a cliffhanger, which is a story that's untold or that's incomplete. And we know that cliffhangers are used, for example, traditionally to get you to watch the next episode in a TV show. So you the last 5 minutes will be reserved for a cliffhanger, and then you'll have to watch the beginning of the next episode to find out what the answer is, which is a sort of cynical tactic, but it works, and it's a narrative device that's very widely deployed in cases where you have multiple episodes in a season. The Sopranos one is interesting because it's a cliffhanger that never gets resolved. And there are some other cases, some very prominent cases in popular culture that are like this. So Sopranos ends in 2007 after 8 years on the air with, it basically cuts to a black screen and you have no idea what's happened. A lot of people, as I say in the book, a lot of people thought that something had gone wrong with the transmission, that it just cut to black and then the credits start rolling. And this is your reward for watching 8 years worth of a show. And the big question that arose, or the big debate that arose, was whether that was supposed to signal that the main character had been killed in that moment. And so that cut to black was his experience of the world in that moment. And it's a debate that it's now, 14 years beyond this point in 2007. And the debate still rages today. It's still going on. It's still a big question that a lot of people have about the show. And actually, very, very recently, David Chase remarked on this issue and said he basically tried to resolve the issue. This is a couple of months ago, I read this. So 14 years later, every time he does an interview, the creator of the show still asks this question: what happened at that point? Did Tony die, or did he live? And was it just the end of the show? Like, what are we supposed to make of this? So people spent 14 years perseverating on a show that itself only lasted 8 years on this one very narrow question because there was no resolution. Now, if he resolved that question for them, which he kind of has actually now, it's going to stop. It'll certainly minimize the attention that it gets. So I think that's going to change things. But yeah, this open cliffhanger, this open loop that was never closed, generates this long sort of hangover where people can't stop thinking about and talking about the show.
Exactly, and there's all this sort of social interaction around that. So, one of the things I guess I should have mentioned, Adam, is that I'm looking out for a puppy who's just started acting up. She was like sitting really sweetly here for the last half an hour, and now she's suddenly acting up. So give me like 30 seconds while I try and deal with it, and I'll be right back.
Absolutely, of course, no worries.
Okay, I'm back. Let's see how that works.
Yeah, no worries at all.
I guess the sort of obvious question here is, where do we go from here? What sort of advice, should one have for parents, kids, policymakers, right? So I want to sort of address those, because one of the things you mentioned is that parents themselves are distracted by devices, and I'm certainly distracted, and I can imagine that younger parents who grew up on technology are a lot more distracted than I am, and distracted parents create distracted children. And you're a parent, like you've got two little kids. Like, how do you deal with this? What should we do about it?
Yeah, this is one of the really interesting trends in the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years, that I used to have parents coming to me saying, I don't know what to do. My kid's glued to this device. What do I do? Can you give me some advice? And it's shifted now where a lot of kids come to me. Like, I'll give a talk at a high school or even in a college, and people will come to me and say, my parents can't get off their screens. Like I sit at the dinner table and I feel like my parents don't want to pay attention to me. They just want to sit on their devices, which is kind of heartbreaking, but it's a big shift. And in some sense, it's for me a little bit heartening in that at least the younger generation is maybe, if not better at dealing with screens, at least mindful of screens in a way that I think people who are not born into the screen era are not mindful. So you ask about these interventions. I think there are, broadly speaking, 2 categories of intervention. There's a top-down intervention and a bottom-up intervention. A bottom-up intervention is a kind of grassroots attempt by consumers at large to say, this is not acceptable, what this company is doing, something needs to change, we need to fix it. Maybe you boycott the company, maybe you find an alternative that's friendlier, whether it's because you have concerns about privacy or whether you think that the company is exploiting your data or you just feel uncomfortable about using the platform because it's mining your attention, whatever the case. So that's grassroots approach. That's just consumer pressure. The other approach is to start at the top, and the top-down approach is to, for example, introduce legislation that outlaws certain practices, suggests that certain approaches are not acceptable. So you actually start with the tech companies themselves, which is what you would do if you had a problem with drug abuse, for example, or an addiction epidemic. The best way to deal with it is to start at the top, is to say, let's not punish all the users of these drugs. Let's go to the top and go to the technologists, or in this case, the chemists who are producing the drugs and the distributors who are distributing the drugs, and say to them, you can't do this with impunity. There are going to be consequences if you do this. And that's, I think, the most fruitful approach. The nature of that legislation is much more complicated. What should that legislation look like, especially in a country like the US, where we're sort of fixated on this idea of liberty in a way that I think a lot of other countries aren't. We want a degree of freedom that I don't think people demand in other countries, while also wanting to be taken care of. And there's an inconsistency there. So that's the big challenge. But yeah, I think there are, broadly speaking, these 2 categories. We can get into what they look like, but there's the grassroots pressure from consumers and there's the top-down pressure from governments in the form of legislation.
So since we're talking about legislation and policy, does that mean that we first need some laws relating to this before we even decide how to enforce them? And I usually draw an analogy with financial services industry where the laws are very clear. You're not supposed to favor one client over another. You don't engage in manipulative practices. And then regulators go and look for that and say, are you in compliance? But it seems to me we don't really have any laws around, let's say, mental health of the society and things like that, because we want to be free. Like you said, we place a big premium on freedom. So do we need to get to that point where we agree on what these laws should look like, such as laws around mental health?
It would be great to have that. It would be great to have agreement. I think that's tough. That's asking a lot for there to be agreement. But certainly we could consider some low-hanging fruit. I think there are some examples of practices that are just, for me, purely cynical. For example, on Snapchat, the idea of the streak function, where I send you a snap, you send one back to me on a particular day. That's a 1-day streak. We do it the next day. It's a 2-day streak, becomes a 3-day streak, and so on. There's a lot of evidence that's terrible for the mental health of teens. And one thing it does is it means that when they go on vacation, they'll give their password to someone else to artificially continue the streak, even as they're not using their phones themselves. which I think is evidence that they're not pursuing a streak because it's fun. They're pursuing it because they don't want to lose it. It's like this baggage that they're carrying around with them. So I think you could have Snapchat, the platform, exist without streaks, and that would just be a better version of the platform, a healthier version of the platform. And I think there are other examples of these kinds of little hooks that are embedded in platforms that should just be removed. They could be removed wholesale, and they don't actually change the nature of the platform all that much. Then you get into the hairier topics like, the nature of an algorithm. If an algorithm is optimized just for engagement, and it's agnostic about welfare, the welfare of consumers, but it turns out that when you do studies, you realize that algorithm is really bad for welfare, which I would argue is the case with Facebook's algorithm, which prioritizes doses of anger, because anger, we know, is galvanizing. It brings us together. It brings us to the screen and keeps us there. That's the kind of thing you could regulate. It's much more difficult to work out what that regulation would look like. I think you'd have a huge amount of pushback from all sorts of different constituencies. But for me, that's something that's worth thinking about. How would we design these platforms to make them better for human welfare? And you could also start to interrogate the business models themselves, right? An intention-driven business model that relies entirely on ad dollars requires that people, like billions of people, spend a lot of their time looking at a screen, and every marginal minute you can extract from them is dollars for you. In contrast, a company like, say, Apple, once you buy an Apple device, as long as you use it and you buy the next one when you consider upgrading, Apple doesn't care if you spend a marginal extra minute on its devices per day. It just wants you to buy the device. It's a sort of healthier business model than, say, the Facebook business model, which requires every minute to be spent on the platform. So one question is, should Facebook be a subscription-based model? Should we be charging people? And one of the benefits of charging people, say, $10 or $20 or $30 a year to use the platform instead of showing them tons of ads and designing an algorithm that keeps them there, is that they can choose to opt out. They can choose not to pay the money for the platform, but the version they get will be rewarding. It'll be designed with their welfare in mind, because if it doesn't, they won't pay for it. There's no other reason for them to be there. And so I think there are, maybe that's an oversimplification, but this idea of considering alternative business models, I think, is really important.
Andrew Yang, who was my guest a few weeks ago, was also suggesting a subscription-based model. And, I couldn't agree more, but it's just so thorny, isn't it?
It is very thorny.
It's so hard to sort of get agreement that, for example, that Facebook is causing social harm because the evidence is strongly suggestive, the timing is suggestive, but there ain't no smoking gun, And so, the platform will say, what? We're not aware of any such thing. Because the cigarette companies, this went on for decades, right? Are cigarettes really harmful to your health? Well, not really. There's not enough evidence. By the time you get that smoking gun, there's so much harm that's been done.
And that was much less thorny. It's much easier to trace a path between a substance and certain physiological outcomes. And still there, we had decades and decades of perseveration. It was a really difficult problem. So, I'm a little pessimistic about it. I think it's a really difficult problem to solve, but I think the first step is to start picking away at maybe at the margins where there are some obvious low-hanging fruit issues that could be addressed more directly. We're moving in the right direction, because even 8 years ago when I started thinking about this, people didn't think this was an issue. They basically said this is a storm in a teacup. 2013, 2014, no one was really focused that much on this question, and that's changed dramatically in the last 8 years, and I think that's very encouraging. Which is, if nothing else, that's a good thing.
Yeah, indeed. When I was preparing for this episode, I just went back and I was the editor of a journal called Big Data for several years. And in 2016, I started collecting papers for a special issue on computational propaganda. And I wrote about it in 2017 as to, whether social media platforms should be regulated. And I just got so much pushback and hate mail for being a commie or being un-American and things like that. It's amazing how much that conversation has now shifted in the right direction, but it's still a really difficult thing to address, to sort of nail down the regulation. I feel for the lawmakers who are mostly in their 50s or 60s or 70s, trying to understand and come up with regulation around technology that they didn't grow up with.
Right. I think one of the fascinating things about this topic is that it's one of the very, very few that unites the left and the right today. There aren't that many of them. Politics in the US is so fragmented, and there's such a big split between the left and the right. But this is an issue. I've spoken about this just as much on left-wing channels as I have on right-wing channels and centrist channels as well. And I think everyone can agree that harming kids is a bad thing. And if we can find ways to connect these experiences, these platforms to those harms, there's value in addressing that. So that's at least, I think, a good thing. That a lot of the legislative efforts have been bipartisan, which is encouraging because that's rare. So the question is what they should look like, and I think that's, as you say, a much thornier problem. But the fact that we're starting to think about that is good. I mean, sometimes I do this thought experiment where I try to imagine what the world would look like if today there were no more Facebook, if we just stopped having this platform, if it ceased to exist. And it's hard for me to think that the net effect would be bad. I think it would be a positive net effect. I think it'd be good for us. I think we'd be happier, we'd be more productive. I think we'd actually paradoxically connect with other people more effectively than we do today. And that's not just true of Facebook. I think that's true of a lot of different platforms. I think we'd be better off mentally. Our welfare would improve. We'd probably exercise more. I can imagine a whole lot of different cascading consequences, most of which I think would be positive. And so that's not a reason to eradicate a platform. You could probably say the same about junk food, but there's a place for junk food in the world, I guess. But I have seen very few really compelling arguments for not regulating. And so I think it's definitely something worth exploring.
So I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the role of the environment, and I want to start talking about, I guess, strategies for dealing with addiction, especially for kids. And one of the examples you give in your book is about the Vietnam vets, as to how many vets actually got addicted to all kinds of interesting substances because they were just bored and there was not a whole lot to do. And a lot of these people came back as addicts and were treated with a phenomenally high rate of success.
Like 95%.
That surprised a lot of people because, typically success with addiction is, my previous guest, Anna Lembke, said, 50-50. Half the time it works, half the time it doesn't. And I think in your case, you referred to this, Vietnam vet example as having a very high degree of success, which was related to sort of the environment. So talk about that, and let's sort of use that to segue into what this means for kids.
Yeah, so it's totally fascinating, and it's often used as the primary example for arguing that addiction is largely a matter of environment or circumstance. And as you said, what happened was these vets went to Vietnam. This was an area where it was easy to get cheap access to heroin, and the heroin there was quite pure, quite strong. And so a lot of them developed these addictions to heroin. And the US government was terrified that they'd have a public health issue on their hands when these vets came back to the US. They expected to have 100 to 150,000 vets who were really struggling with heroin addiction issues. And the data had suggested that people in that sort of situation who were using as much heroin as these vets were when they were over in Vietnam, the success rate in treating them, the first round success rate was about 5 to 10%. So only about 1 in 10 to 1 in 20, or 1 in 20 to 1 in 10 of them would be able to wean themselves off the drug. And the government was prepared for this. And so the vets started to trickle back into the US, and then eventually they started to come back in floods. And lo and behold, 95% of them managed to shake this addiction, which was just completely contrary to most of the data that the government had. And what they realized was that so much of addiction is about context. So it's about what it was like to be in that situation. They were bored. There was a lot of time where they weren't actually seeing action. They spent months and months, years and years out in jungles where there just wasn't that much for them to do. This is a way to pass the time. It was a way of dealing with the loneliness and anxiety and boredom and so on. And once you brought them back to the US, it was a completely different context. Most of them had jobs. They had social support. They had loved ones around them. And so the minute they had all of that social support, they didn't turn to the drug. They had none of the triggers that were there to inspire that response, that need, that craving were there. And so some of them experienced withdrawal for sure. But as soon as they got past that initial phase of acute withdrawal, they were okay. Their bodies got past it. And psychologically, they didn't feel the cravings that addicts tend to feel when they stay in the same context. And I think it was really strong evidence that so much of this experience, these addictions, is about circumstance. It's about the environment that you're in.
Does that mean, I guess, for parents now that, if they're seeing this kind of behavior, that the key to sort of shaking it, is just to sort of change the environment?
Yeah,
if they can?
I think so. I think it's the best thing you can do. It's an analog solution to a very digital problem. A lot of my friends, we'll have like a little box in the kitchen, and when we have dinner, we'll put all our devices in the boxes. A lot of us do this now, and it's such a basic analog solution. You just take the device, you put it in the box, and it sits there while you have dinner. But that just changing the context there, just creating some distance between you and the device is all you need to do. And there's this old psychological concept known as propinquity, which is this idea that the things that are closest to you in physical space have an outsized effect on your psychological experience of the world. So, if you have a phone that's effectively an implant, it's around you all the time. It's always available. It's always accessible. It's functionally an implant. And so as much of the time as you can, if you remove yourself from that device, you keep it away from you. It seems like a simple kind of almost silly suggestion, but it has a huge effect on whether you're going to use that device. If it's not near you, if it's in another room, if it's locked in a closet somewhere, you're not going to use it. And so I think we just need to be mindful about forming those habits and cultivating those habits where we spend as much of the day as possible far away from our devices. And that's the best solution I know of, and it works. So parents just need to be mindful. For example, no phones in the bedroom, no phones an hour before bedtime, no phones an hour after waking up. These are examples. You don't have to stick to these exactly. Maybe for like 8 hours on a weekend, put your phone on airplane mode so you can use it as a camera, but it's not going to be a proper phone. Those kinds of interventions, as basic as they are unbelievably effective because you're defanging this device. It's like if you had a cigarette and you took all the nicotine out of it and it just ended up being this acrid smoke, it would be much less appealing. And it's the same thing. You can defang these devices as well in the same way.
Talking about devices, this reminds me of a story you narrated, and I think you have data for this, where you ask, you give them a choice between smashing their phone or breaking a little bone in their hand. What's your experience with that question? I mean, it seems like an absurd question.
It does, yeah.
To me, and yet the responses are telling. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I've asked thousands of people this question now. I ask it all the time. It's a simple binary question. You've got to make a choice between two outcomes. One is your phone tumbles out of your pocket, hits the ground and smashes into 1,000 pieces. You have to get a new phone or you have to get your phone repaired. Or you can have a small bone in your hand broken. So like a bone in maybe one of your fingers. And if you ask people above a certain age, and that age has varied over time, but it's, let's say, late 20s now. If you ask people in their late 20s and older, they almost take the question as an affront. It's almost offensive to be asking that question. And almost all of them universally and very quickly say, obviously, I'd prefer to have a broken phone than a broken bone in my hand. But if you ask young people as young as, say, 12 or 13 and up to, I'd say just leading into college age, this is a real struggle. And the way you see that manifest itself is you have a little bit of bargaining, some questioning. They'll come back with follow-up questions like, once I break the bone in my hand, can I still use my phone? How much will it cost to have both of those repaired? Will I eventually gain full function of my hand? The fact that they're even asking these questions suggests that this is a difficult puzzle. And almost half of them ultimately say, I'd rather have a broken bone in my hand than a broken phone. Not quite half, but almost half. And the reason for that is, I think the knee-jerk response is to say, well, there's something wrong. We've broken a generation. We've somehow done something to this generation. And what's wrong with the youth of today? Which is an age-old question. And I think that's completely the wrong response. The right response is to say, what are we depriving the youth of when we take away those phones? And I think it's that so much of their social welfare, their psychological welfare lives on that device. And it suggests that it's much more complicated than just saying you can't use your phone, because you introduce other harms when you do that. So I think one of the things parents need to do is just fully sort of try to understand what is it that makes it so hard for your child to give up the phone. Not just to say, right, you're banned, that's it, you can't use your phone, but to try to inhabit the mind space of these teens who are living in this world where the phone represents such an incredible suite of options, of access, of welfare, of work, of social connections, and so on. I think that's the first step in being a parent to kids who are living in this generation.
So what does this all mean for educators, right? For schools? I'm talking middle schools, high schools, universities. A few months ago, I had Ali Velshi on the show, and we were talking about the necessity of making kids savvy consumers of information as early as middle school. And a few months after that, I was talking to Danny Kahneman about the importance of maybe teaching people sort of Bayesian thinking and that kind of reasoning in high school, before they enter full crush, of the real world. It seems to be that we need to be teaching kids stuff earlier and earlier. So what should middle school teachers be doing?
I think digital hygiene, understanding how you use your phone, the consequences of using your phone, that should be taught as early as possible. It should be taught really early because it's an important practical issue that people are going to face for the rest of their lives. I think so much of education focuses on these very arcane subjects that most people won't use for the rest of their lives. There's some value to those subjects. I'm not saying they shouldn't be taught them. But here's a subject that's going to affect absolutely everyone. And I think if we know from the age of 13, 14, 15 what a phone is, what it's doing to us, why it might be hard for us to resist using and so on, I think we become much more effective consumers of phones, much more mindful, much better able to say, I should be using this or I shouldn't be using this. So I think there's great value there. I would say as well, though, that yes, there's value in teaching digital hygiene, but I'm not hardline about teens using phones, but I'm pretty hardline about phones in the education context and screens in the education context. I see almost no role for them to be used in educational context, except where they are the vehicle of delivery of certain kinds of information that can't be delivered any other way. If you're teaching kids to code, there's immense value in that, and they should have a screen to do that. They should learn to code in front of a screen. But beyond that, so much of what we learn does not need to be learned in front of a screen, and we learn it much more effectively when it's standing in front of a human being who's talking to us. One of the things I love about Stern, where we both teach, is that the students are not supposed to use devices. In some classes they do, but I always fall back on that and I say, you know what? We don't use screens in our classroom, and it's because you'll learn better, you'll learn more effectively, there'll be a more engaging discussion and experience, and it'll be better for you in the long run. And it is. It's better for everyone. It works better, I think. And I think that's only more true with younger students.
So you enforce the no screen in the classroom norm?
I do, yeah. I may be in the minority now, but I still enforce it, absolutely.
Has remote teaching via Zoom changed things? Or
I tell you what it did. I taught from the fall of 2020 through the summer of 2021. So I taught about a year. And a lot of teaching. I taught different classes to different audiences and gave a number of talks on Zoom. The thing that I had to do, the main adaptation, I didn't change much about the way I taught, but what I did was I became much more sort of schizophrenic in the way I taught. I bounced around a lot more. So what I do when I'm standing up in the classroom is I have a basic rule: no format or a topic should last longer than 15 or 20 minutes in person. So if we're doing a case study, I'm going to bounce around enough so that every 15 or 20 minutes we're doing something different. Now it's discussion, now it's lecture-based, now we're going to watch a video. And I do that just to keep people's attention. It's a basic principle of psychology. It's not that insightful. But I found that didn't work on Zoom. And I had to change it from 15 to 20 minutes to like 5 to 7 minutes. So my class became really staccato. I'd bounce around constantly. And I had to kind of chop it up in much finer pieces for it to be digestible by the audience. And I think that's just because the kind of attention you train on a screen is incredibly sapping. It's exhausting. It requires a degree of focus that you don't need if you're in the same room as someone else. If you and I are having a conversation on Zoom and I look to the side for a minute, which is a very natural thing to do, you don't know what I'm looking at. We're not in the same context. And that detracts from our connection. And so as a result, if you're talking to someone on Zoom, you feel compelled to train your gaze straight ahead the entire time. That's very unnatural for humans. It's not how we communicate. And we don't have the benefit of eye contact. It feels like eye contact. It's a kind of simulation of contact, but it's not real. And so putting all of that together, Zoom just basically asks an incredible amount of people. And we're asking them to do that for 8, 9, 10 hours a day, depending on the jobs they do. I think that's just a lot. And so what I tried to do was to make it less demanding by allowing people's minds to wander and by giving them, really finely chopped up bits of content. And I think that worked reasonably well.
Do you think kids have shorter attention spans these days?
Yes, I do. I think they've learned that because, if you think about what it was like to live in the 19th century, the early 20th century, even into the middle of the 20th century, you had to make your own fun. You had to find entertainment. It didn't visit itself upon you. And then TV came along, and it certainly gave you entertainment when you were hungry for some, you could turn on the TV and you could find a show and you could watch a show. But now you get into an elevator for 3 seconds, and every single person in the elevator takes out a phone. Now, partly that's just because it's socially awkward to be in an elevator, and this is one way to solve that. But I think it's also because we've learned to be completely intolerant of boredom. As soon as we become bored, we take out a device, and that's supposed to paper over the boredom. And that's a learned response to boredom. Boredom's unpleasant, but it's also incredibly good for us and important for us to be able to endure it. We don't have that capacity anymore. And so I think that's a pretty big problem.
Yeah, no, I'm sort of chuckling to myself because I remember as a kid, if I complained to my parents I was bored, they said, well, then, go find something to do. And I'd wander into the streets and find some people to play cricket with on the street.
Exactly.
So it's interesting, you really did have to sort of seek out, your entertainment. It wasn't there, just coming at you.
Yeah, I mean, think about how much you can do on an iPad now. And it's bottomless. You could find a million new apps. My son, who's 5, has just started kindergarten. One of his friends was using an iPad, and it just blew my son's mind. We've kept him away from iPads. He doesn't use them except on long car rides. He thinks they're a way of watching TV. Yeah. But other than that, he doesn't know what an iPad is for until his friend then says to him, hey, check out this game I've got on my iPad. And it blew his mind. He's now saying to me, what else can I get on this thing? And once the door is open, it's impossible to shut. So, they're remarkable devices. They're wonderful. There's incredible utility in them.
Yeah.
But the downside is there's incredible utility in them.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, while we're talking about retention, I want to come back to something we were talking about earlier, which is the London cab driver phenomenon of them, having memorized maps, and the importance of actually doing some things that require attention, right? That they're difficult, right? That solving difficult problems for its own sake is useful, as opposed to sort of everything becoming easy.
Yeah.
That seems like a really important lesson, especially for parents, even more so than kids.
I think so. It's overused, but the idea that the mind is a muscle, I think, is largely true, that if you stop using it, it atrophies. As a kid, I probably knew, without much effort, and I wasn't unique this way, I probably knew 50 or 100 phone numbers. The idea of trying to memorize a phone number now, it's bizarre to me that I ever was able to do that. It seems superhuman. If someone came up to me and said, I can tell you 100 friends' phone numbers, I think they were a savant. And that's what we could all do. It was just a natural way of living that you memorized phone numbers, and they stuck in your mind, and they were there in long-term memory. I still remember phone numbers from actually the 80s that are still in my head. And I think that muscle, because we used it, we probably had better developed long-term memory stores and strategies for coping with memorizing a lot of information. I don't think kids could do that now as effectively. I think it's important to endure some hardship. I've done some work on this concept known as hardship inoculation, and it's this idea that like a vaccine that exposes you to small doses of whatever the virus is, if you experience small doses of hardship, you're much better placed to deal with big doses of hardship. And there's quite a lot of evidence from this from, for example, sports. Teams that face in the preseason harder competition tend to do better during the season itself, for example. It's true in business. It seems to be true in a lot of different contexts. And I think it's problematic for us in the way we live today, because I think we paper over so much hardship by just saying, here's a device, go sit in the corner and use this. It'll be easy. And that's bad, I think. And also relying so heavily on outsourcing is a problem too. Asking, say, Google to answer questions where we used to have to try a little bit harder to get the answer. We actually thought a little bit about the answer before we asked a device for that answer. I think that was a valuable process for us.
Indeed. So in closing, Adam, any thoughts on Section 230 and all of this protection that digital platforms enjoy? I mean, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but what do you think we should do about Section 230?
Which aspects would you like me to comment on?
Any aspects you want, because we haven't done a whole lot yet. So any progress in that direction, I think, would be progress.
As you'd imagine, based on my general beliefs about the topic, I think it's problematic that the platforms are protected in these ways, and it's concerning. I think, obviously, yeah.
Are you optimistic that we'll actually do something about it?
I'm generally pretty pessimistic about this stuff. I think everything moves pretty slowly. We've already talked about how difficult this is and how it's even more complicated than what goes on in cases like the tobacco industry. So I'm generally a little bit pessimistic about it.
Well, I hate to end on the pessimistic notes. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I'll end on a slightly more optimistic note. I do think that one thing I didn't foresee when I started studying all this was that I think younger people who are born into this era are doing a better job of coping with it than I anticipated and that older adults are doing. And I think that's good. So I'm hopeful that there will be some coping skills developed. There are certain features of what it is to be human that I don't think we can overcome. So, for example, going on social media and seeing that everyone's living their best possible life and they're sharing with you is always going to be damaging. That social comparison effect is profound. But beyond that, I do think younger people are developing coping styles and coping mechanisms that might stand them in better stead than maybe I and others anticipated. And I'm hopeful of that. That's the one hopeful note I can sound at the moment.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So let's hope that actually happens. And I'm perhaps a little more hopeful that lawmakers will get their heads around Section 230 and maybe start nibbling away at it.
I hope so.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ideas that I've been trying to define more clearly is sort of this notion of, are you amplifying content? And if you're amplifying content, maybe you should be treated as a publisher. I mean, these are all interesting ideas, but getting to the point where it's sort of sufficiently compelling is a pretty hard slog.
Yeah, that's why I said I'm generally pessimistic, just because I think the devil is in the details with all of these forms of legislation, and that it's so easy to get hung up on those details that making progress has been extremely tricky. And I think the best we've been able to do, as you said, you use the term nibble. I use that term as well because it seems like at the periphery we can make tiny little inroads, but to deal with the nugget of the problem has been very difficult traditionally. So we'll have to see.
Indeed. Well, Adam, it's been fascinating. I don't know where the hour went, but here we are. Thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with the rest of the world. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Vasant. I enjoyed it.